The night glittered with chandeliers and promises, but for her, New Year's Eve began with humiliation instead of hope. Snow melted against the marble steps as she stood frozen outside the grand ballroom, clutching a designer handbag that suddenly felt heavier than her entire fortune. A woman who signed million-dollar deals before breakfast had just been rejected at the door like she was nobody. Inside, laughter rose, glasses clinked, and a new year was being welcomed without her. She had everything money could buy, yet at that moment she had never felt so small. Before the story continues, pause for a second. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of unexpected humanity, please like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel Acts That Matter. Your support helps stories like this reach hearts that need them. She was known in business magazines as a fearless CEO, a self-made millionaire who had clawed her way out of poverty with relentless discipline. Her company employed thousands, her signature moved markets, and her face often appeared beside words like visionary and unstoppable. But none of that mattered to the man at the entrance who glanced at the guest list, frowned, and shook his head. There had been a mistake, he said. The hall was full. No exceptions. The tone was polite but final, the kind reserved for people whose protests would never matter. She tried to explain, tried to stay composed, but every word sounded hollow in the cold air. When she finally turned away, the doors closed behind her with a sound that echoed deeper than any insult she had ever received. As she stepped aside, fighting the sting behind her eyes, she noticed a man nearby, kneeling beside a service door. His dark uniform was smeared with grease, his hands rough and scarred from years of fixing what others discarded. A small child sat on a folded coat next to him, swinging her legs, her eyes wide as she watched the glittering crowd through the glass. The man was a mechanic called in for an emergency when one of the heating systems failed just hours before the event. He wasn't meant to be seen by guests, only tolerated as long as he stayed invisible. The CEO barely noticed him at first. Her mind was spiraling, replaying the rejection, the years of sacrifices, the loneliness that wealth had never filled. She had come tonight hoping to feel something different, maybe to believe the new year could soften her sharp edges. Instead, she felt stripped of every title she had built her identity on. She walked toward her car, heels clicking against stone, when a soft sound stopped her. The child had dropped a small paper crown, one of those flimsy decorations handed out to staff children waiting on the sidelines. It slid across the floor and stopped near the CEO's feet. She bent down and picked it up, handing it back to the little girl. The child smiled with a kind of pure gratitude that felt almost painful. For a moment the world slowed. The mechanic looked up, embarrassed, murmuring thanks, clearly aware of the distance between them. The CEO nodded and turned to leave, but something in her chest felt heavier than before. She paused, glanced back at the glowing ballroom doors, then at the man and his child sitting in the shadows. The mechanic had been promised a small bonus if he could fix the system before midnight. He needed it desperately. The child was his daughter, the only family he had left after losing his wife to illness years earlier. That night, he couldn't afford a babysitter, so he brought her along, telling her stories about machines and how broken things could still work again if someone cared enough. He had watched the elegant guests arrive, their laughter echoing through halls he would never enter, and he had accepted that as his place in the world. What he didn't accept was his daughter feeling invisible. When he noticed the CEO standing there, rejected and shaken, he saw something different from what the others saw. He saw a woman who looked lost, not powerful. A woman who, despite her wealth, seemed just as alone as he felt most nights after work. He stood up, wiped his hands on his uniform, and did something that would ripple far beyond that moment. He walked toward the entrance, past the guards who barely noticed him, and asked a simple question. He asked if the table near the back, reserved for staff emergencies, was still empty. The guard shrugged. It wasn't meant for guests, but technically it was unused. The mechanic nodded, thanked him, then turned back toward the CEO. He didn't beg or explain. He simply gestured toward the door and told her there was a place she could sit if she wanted, nothing fancy, just warm and quiet. The offer was humble, almost awkward, but it carried something she hadn't felt all evening, sincerity without judgment. For a moment, pride flared inside her. She could walk away, call another venue, or retreat to her penthouse and pretend none of this mattered. But exhaustion won. She nodded. Inside, the ballroom looked different from that angle. The music was distant, the laughter softer. She sat at the small table near the wall, watching as servers rushed by, as couples toasted futures she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The mechanic returned to his work and the child sat nearby, drawing shapes on a napkin. No one recognized her. No one cared who she was. And strangely, that anonymity felt like relief. As midnight approached, the heating system finally hummed back to life. The mechanic finished his work just as applause erupted across the room. Fireworks bloomed outside the tall windows, light reflecting in crystal glasses and tired eyes. The mechanic picked up his daughter, whispering something that made her giggle. The CEO watched them, feeling an ache she couldn't name. She realized she hadn't smiled like that in years. When the crowd thinned and guests began to leave, she stood and approached the mechanic. She thanked him not just for the seat but for reminding her of something she had forgotten. He shrugged it off, uncomfortable with praise. To him, it was nothing, just being decent, but for her, it cracked something open. They parted ways without exchanging names. She drove home through empty streets, fireworks fatting behind her, her mind replaying the night over and over. For the first time in a long while, she didn't measure the evening in deals or appearances, but in moments. A paper crown, a quiet table, a man who had nothing to gain and still chose kindness. Weeks passed. The new year began as usual, filled with meetings and numbers, but something had shifted. She found herself thinking about the mechanic and his daughter during long boardroom discussions. She started asking questions she never had before. Who fixed the machines in her factories? Who cleaned the offices after hours? Who made her success possible without ever being seen? One afternoon, she asked her assistant to track down the maintenance company that serviced the ballroom. When she found the mechanic, she didn't approach him as a CEO or benefactor. She approached him as a human being. She learned about his life, his skills, his struggles. She learned how often he had been overlooked despite his talent and work ethic. What she did next changed both their lives. She invested in him, not with charity, but with opportunity. She helped him start a small technical services company, offering contracts to maintain equipment across her corporate buildings. She insisted on fair wages, training programs, and benefits for workers who had always lived one emergency away from disaster. The mechanic resisted at first, suspicious of sudden generosity, but she stayed consistent, patient, proving her intentions through actions, not promises. The business grew. The mechanic became an employer, then a leader. His daughter watched her father transform from a man always tired and worried into someone standing tall with pride. He never forgot where he came from, and neither did the CEO. She visited job sites, listened to workers, learned names. Slowly, her company culture began to change. Kindness stopped being a slogan and started becoming practice. Years later, on another New Year's Eve, the CEO stood once again in a grand hall, but this time, the lights felt warmer. The mechanic, now a successful entrepreneur, stood nearby with his daughter, who wore a real crown this time, laughing as she spun beneath the chandeliers. The CEO watched them, her eyes shining, knowing that the most important deal of her life had been made the night she was rejected. Just before the ending, take a moment and comment below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of kindness that changed a life? Your stories matter more than you know. As the countdown began, she realized that success without compassion was empty, and that sometimes being turned away is exactly what leads us to where we belong. One small act from a man the world ignored had reshaped her future, her values, and the lives of countless others. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that humanity can still surprise us in the darkest moments, please like this video, share it, and let us know your thoughts. Subscribe to Acts That Matter and stay with us, because the world changes not through grand gestures alone, but through quiet choices made by ordinary people on ordinary nights.